"That seat isn't for you," my father said, and before I could even process the tone in his voice, he shoved my 9-year-old off the chair. It wasn't a dramatic push. It was quick, casual. Her small body tipped sideways and hit the hardwood in front of 12 relatives who suddenly went very, very still. I remember the sound more than anything, that sharp, flat crack of bone and wood, and the way no one moved. I stood up, lifted Noah into my arms, ran my hands down her spine and ribs right there beside the table, and said we were leaving. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at anyone twice. "My name is Elena Mercer. I'm 36. We were living in the carriage house behind my parents' place on Ashford Lane. It sounds quaint when I say it like that. Carriage house, like something out of a renovation show with exposed beams and soft lighting. It wasn't that. It was small. One bedroom upstairs with a sloped ceiling that dipped low enough I hit my head twice the first month we moved in. A narrow kitchen. A living room that doubled as my office when I charted late shifts from the hospital. But it was clean, it was stable. And after what Noah had already lived through by the time she was 4, stable felt like oxygen. I adopted her after she'd been moved through 2 foster homes in 18 months. 2 different bedrooms. 2 different sets of adults learning her favorite cereal and then disappearing. When she first came to me, she lined her shoes up by the door every night before bed. Perfectly straight, like she was preparing to leave quickly if she had to. So when my father offered the cottage behind their house, I told myself it was practical. Close to help, close to family, close to people who were supposed to love her. I paid him $1,250 every month. On the first, automatic transfer, no exceptions. I kept every confirmation email in a folder labeled Rent Carriage. 78 months of digital receipts. I don't even know why I was that meticulous at the beginning. Habit maybe. I'm a trauma nurse. Documentation is survival. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. At the time, I didn't question the amount. I told myself it was market rate. I told myself contributing made me independent. I told myself this was what adults did. You don't take handouts, especially not from your parents. My father liked to remind me the property was valuable, that I was lucky. There were comments over the years, small ones, about Noah being sensitive, about how kids these days needed firmer discipline, about how adoption was complicated. They were delivered with that thin smile that makes you doubt your own reaction. I labeled it old school, generational, blunt, but not cruel. It was easier to translate it that way. If my mother stayed quiet at dinner when my father made those remarks, I told myself she just didn't like confrontation. If my sister rolled her eyes when Noah talked too long about a school project, I told myself siblings get annoyed. I kept smoothing it out in my head, reframing, adjusting, because the alternative, that we were living on land controlled by someone who didn't fully see my child as his granddaughter, was heavier than I wanted to hold. Financially, it made sense to stay. My shifts were long, overnight sometimes. Having them 30 yards away meant backup if I got stuck at work. It meant familiarity. It meant tradition, holidays in the main house. Sunday dinners, the illusion of roots. And every month, I paid on time. Looking back, I can see the imbalance. The subtle way dependency creeps in when the person collecting your rent is also the person setting the tone at the dinner table. But at the time, I believed I was building something steady. I believed proximity would soften whatever sharp edges existed. I believed that if I just kept everything orderly, the payments, the expectations, the gratitude, then Noah and I would belong there without question. Christmas dinner was always formal in my parents' house. My mother polished the silver until it reflected the chandelier. The long dining table was extended to its full length, layered in cream linen and those heavy plates that only came out twice a year. 12 of us, maybe 13, squeezed in shoulder to shoulder. The air smelled like rosemary and wine and something sweet from the kitchen. Noah had been excited all afternoon. She'd worn a red dress with tights that kept twisting at the ankle, and she'd carried one of her watercolor paintings with her like it was a gift. It was a small piece, a winter tree with uneven branches and too much blue in the sky, but she was proud of it. When we sat down, she quietly taped it to the back of her chair. Not on the table, not in anyone's way, just behind her, like a little flag marking her place. I saw it and almost told her to take it down, not because it was wrong, just because I've learned to anticipate reactions in that house. But everyone was talking. Glasses were clinking. My father was carving the roast at the head of the table. For a few minutes, it felt normal. Then he noticed it. It wasn't immediate. It was subtle. His knife paused mid-slice. His eyes shifted over Noah's shoulder. The room was still loud enough that I didn't register what had changed until his voice cut through it. "That seat isn't for you." It wasn't shouted at first. It was sharp, flat, the kind of tone that doesn't invite discussion. Noah blinked up at him, confused. She didn't move. She looked at me instead, like she was checking if she'd done something wrong. He stepped around the table. There's a moment, I keep replaying it, where I thought he was going to peel the tape off the chair and make some irritated comment about manners. That would have fit the pattern. That would have been something I could smooth over later. Instead, his hand went to the back of the chair, and he pushed. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't a dramatic shove with raised voice and flailing arms. It was controlled, efficient. The chair tipped just enough. Noah's body followed the angle of gravity before her feet could catch. She hit the hardwood on her side, then her back. The sound echoed, that hard, unforgiving crack against the floor. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A fork clinked against a plate somewhere near my sister. Someone inhaled sharply, and then nothing. No one stood up. My mother's hands were still wrapped around her wine glass. My sister stared at the table. A cousin looked down at his phone like it had suddenly become urgent. 12 adults in a room with a child on the floor. My father stepped back from the chair, like he'd corrected a minor inconvenience. The painting was still taped to the wood, crooked now. Noah didn't cry right away. She looked stunned more than anything. Her face searching the room, trying to understand the rules she had apparently broken without being told. And that was the moment it shifted for me. This wasn't a comment. It wasn't old-school bluntness. It wasn't generational tone. It was a line crossed in front of witnesses. And every person at that table chose stillness. I was on my knees before I even remembered deciding to move. Training takes over in moments like that. My hands slid under Noah's shoulders and hips carefully, supporting her neck as I lifted her. She felt small, smaller than usual. I sat back on my heels right there beside the dining table and ran my fingers along her spine, pressing lightly over each vertebra, watching her face for any flinch that didn't match the pressure. Then her ribs, gentle compression along both sides. I checked her collarbone, the back of her head, the way her pupils focused when she looked at me. "Breathe in for me," I said quietly. My voice was steady, too steady. She inhaled, shaky but full. No sharp cry, no immediate guarding. Around us, chairs scraped softly against hardwood as people shifted in discomfort, but still no one stepped forward. No one knelt down. No one said her name. My father remained standing near the head of the table. I didn't look at him again. If I had, I don't know what would have shown on my face. When I was sure nothing was obviously fractured, I stood up with her in my arms. She wrapped herself around me without being asked. I picked up her small coat from the back of the hallway chair. I didn't rush. I didn't slam doors. I did narrate what I was doing. "We're leaving," I said, not loudly, just enough. The room stayed quiet. No apology, no protest, no attempt to stop us. Cold air hit my face when I stepped outside. It felt clarifying. Noah buried her face into my shoulder as we crossed the yard toward the carriage house. I could feel her heartbeat through her dress, fast but steady. Inside, I set her down gently on the couch and checked her again under better light. There was already a faint redness blooming across the middle of her back. Nothing broken, but I've seen enough blunt force injuries to know bruises deepen with time. I helped her change into pajamas. She was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural, not sulking, not crying, just measuring something. My phone started vibrating before I'd even finished tucking her in. One message, then 3, then 8. It didn't stop. The family group thread, individual texts, notifications stacking on top of each other until my screen was just a wall of previews. I didn't open them immediately. I knew the tone without reading them. When I finally did, the words were almost identical in theme, that I'd overreacted, that I'd made a scene, that Christmas was ruined, that my father was embarrassed in his own home. Not one message asked if Noah was hurt. not when asked if she was okay. That was the part that landed heavier than the shove. Later, when the house had gone quiet and the notifications slowed to a dull trickle, Noah padded into the kitchen, where I was standing at the sink, pretending to rinse a clean plate. She didn't look at me when she asked, "Was Grandpa mad because I'm not actually ours?" The phrasing knocked the air out of me. Not, "Did I do something wrong?" Not, "Is he mad at me?" She was asking about belonging. I turned the faucet off because my hands had started shaking. I knelt down so we were eye level. I told her no, that she was mine, that she was ours, that none of that had anything to do with her. But the fact that she asked meant something had already been settling into her long before that chair hit the floor. And I realized this hadn't started at dinner. The next morning, I hadn't even finished my first cup of coffee when the pounding came at the door. Noah had crawled back under the covers, still shivering from the shock of the night before, and I was half-dressed, trying to clear my head. Then came the knock, hard, urgent, insistent. My father's voice followed immediately, sharp and carrying across the thin walls of the cottage. "Open up, it's my property," he barked before I even reached the door. I hesitated, caught off guard. The words themselves made my stomach tighten. Not a complaint, not a request, a flat assertion, ownership, claim, control. My father had never spoken to me this way in our own space, never leveled that kind of absolute certainty. I cracked the door open just enough to see him standing there, face flushed, chest rigid, the kind of stance that had always meant he was prepared to fight for authority, whether it belonged to him or not. He waved a hand toward the cottage, like he was claiming invisible keys, invisible locks, invisible rights. "This is mine. You have no say here. You're overstepping. All of it is mine." I kept my voice even, calm, but my fingers moved almost unconsciously to the small voice recorder I always kept tucked in my kitchen drawer. Not because I expected this day to come, not because I wanted to escalate, but because my instincts, honed after years in trauma nursing, knew that clarity would protect us. I pressed record. He didn't notice at first, or maybe he did and assumed I was too shaken to act. "I've let this go on for far too long," he continued. "This cottage, the house, everything behind it, it's mine. You've been living here under my terms. You've been paying me rent. You think that changes anything? It doesn't, it never has." I stayed silent, letting him ramble. My pulse was steady but sharp. My hands gripped the counter. Noah peeked out from the bedroom door, her small eyes wide. I told her to stay put and watch quietly. Something in the way he phrased it, that repeated emphasis on mine, struck me differently than all the other control he'd exerted over the years. Ownership, possession, not metaphorical authority but actual legal claim. The wording felt precise, almost rehearsed, as if he'd convinced himself so thoroughly that he believed it. I kept recording, because words like that, absolute, declarative, could not go unheard, not when the weight of history and money and trust hung between us. I didn't answer. I didn't argue. I didn't let him see the tremor in my chest tighten further. And yet the moment lodged itself in my mind. That phrase, "It's my property," repeated over and over, kept circling. It was simple. It was dangerous. It was the seed. Something about it told me this was no longer just about a shove at dinner or family pride. Something about it whispered that if I didn't act, what we thought was ours, the little stability we'd built in the carriage house, could slip through our fingers. For the first time in years, I felt the lines of control begin to shift. Not yet visible, not yet public, but tangible. A quiet, unsettling urgency had entered the room, and I knew we had to respond. I drove over to my grandmother Aliner's apartment later that morning. She was 79, sharp as a tack, the kind of woman whose glasses never slip and whose voice carries authority even when she's seated. The elevator ride-up felt too long, my mind racing with the words my father had shouted the night before, "It's my property," looping over and over like a warning bell. She opened the door before I could knock. Her apartment smelled faintly of lavender and old books, the curtains drawn just enough to catch the sun in soft slats. I could see her spine was still straight, shoulders squared, and in that moment I felt a strange calm wash over me, one I hadn't realized I'd been craving since Christmas. I told her everything, fast, breathless at first, like I had to get it all out before she could interrupt. About dinner, about the shove, about his words at the cottage, about the rent, the accusations, how Noah had asked if she was actually ours. She listened quietly, nodding occasionally, her hands folded in her lap. No judgment, no gasp, just presence. When I finished, I waited for the sigh, the wave of worry, the oh my that I thought would inevitably come. Instead, she leaned back, adjusted her glasses, and said, "Elena, the deed for that carriage house was never transferred to your father." The words hit me in a different way than I expected. I blinked. "What do you mean?" "Legally," she said slowly, "it's still mine." Her tone was calm, steady, the kind of quiet certainty that made me feel like the floor beneath me had just shifted. "I never signed it over. He's been collecting rent on a property that he doesn't own." I sank into the chair across from her, trying to process. 78 months of $1,250 payments, $97,500, all meticulously documented, all paid to a man who thought he had the right to push my child off a chair and claim the land as his own. "You're telling me he has no claim," my voice caught. "Correct," she said, sipping her tea. "It's always been mine, and it will remain so until I say otherwise." I stared at her, the weight of years of subtle intimidation and quiet humiliation pressing on me. I felt a pulse of relief, yes, but also a surge of anger. For the first time, I realized that the power dynamics that had governed my life, my daughter's life, were not as fixed as I'd believed. The line my father had drawn, the authority he wielded at the table, the control he exercised over our living situation, it was negotiable. Fragile, even. She reached across and placed a hand over mine, not as a grandmother comforting a granddaughter, but as someone asserting facts against false claims. Her calm was terrifying in its effectiveness. I could feel the shift already, even in that quiet apartment. The legal footing was hers. And for the first time, the door to challenging my father's actions didn't just exist, it was wide open. The truth sank in slowly. My father had been confident, unshakable in his declaration the day before, but Eleanor's words toppled that confidence with quiet certainty. The power structure had tilted. I could feel it, and I knew what that meant for the next steps. The day after my visit with Eleanor, I met with Daniel Reyes, the attorney my grandmother had recommended. Daniel was methodical, precise, and calm in a way that I needed after the emotional roller coaster of Christmas and the morning confrontation. I laid out everything. The rent checks, the receipts, the dates, every payment I had made over the past 6.5 years. He spread them across the conference table, lining each one up like soldiers in formation. "Let's see what we're looking at," he said. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but also a strange sense of anticipation. Clarity was coming. He started adding, $1,250 a month. Multiply that by 78 months. The total blinked up at me in black and white, $97,500. My heart sank. Nearly $100,000 funneled directly into my father's hands for a property that didn't belong to him. The logic of it made my fingers tremble slightly. That sum wasn't just money. It was a ledger of humiliation, of years of bending to his rules, of implicit threats I'd silently endured while trying to provide a home for Noah. Then Daniel shifted to something else, the education trust my grandmother had set up for her grandchildren. He brought out statements, line after line of withdrawals, each one dated, categorized, and accounted for. My eyes scanned as he pointed to totals. 16 withdrawals, $112,400, almost every transaction justified as academic expenses for my niece Sloane, who, I reminded myself silently, attended public school. I realized slowly, with a tightening in my chest, that Noah's name wasn't on a single document. Not one. The child I had adopted and loved, the one I had shielded from harm, the one who had been shoved from a chair in front of family, entirely excluded from a trust designed to provide for family education. Daniel didn't look up from the papers. "This is systematic," he said. "It's all accounted for, but your daughter isn't included at all. She's been left out of the records entirely." I sat back, my hands gripping the edge of the table. My stomach churned with the realization that this wasn't a small oversight, not a careless mistake. This was a deliberate pattern. Financially, legally, emotionally, they had been erasing Noah from the system, from the family, from her own inheritance. Daniel continued, methodically pointing out each withdrawal, each rent payment, each mismatch between what was promised in writing and what had been executed in reality. He explained how, legally, this gave us leverage evidence to correct the course and protect Noah. But hearing it aloud, seeing the sums laid bare, made the betrayal tangible. I had always known something was off. Now I could quantify it, see it in crisp, precise numbers. Every figure was a punchline to the silent joke my father had played over the years. I felt both fury and exhaustion, but beneath it was a simmering sense of power. For the first time, the pattern of his deception had a tangible counterpoint. Proof, evidence, numbers that could no longer be ignored. By the time I left Daniel's office, I was quiet, processing. The financial betrayal was clear, undeniable, and staring back at me like a mirror I couldn't look away from. This was the next domino, the seed of the reckoning, and I knew, deep in my chest, that we were about to move it. After leaving Daniel's office, the momentum shifted almost immediately from discovery to action. My grandmother, Alina, didn't hesitate. Within days, she had frozen the trust she had set up for her grandchildren. No more withdrawals, no more excuses. Every transaction halted, every fund accounted for. That simple act made the first real statement. The family could no longer manipulate, divert, or ignore what was rightfully Noah's. Simultaneously, Daniel prepared a certified 30-day notice for my parents, demanding that they vacate the main house, the very place they had occupied rent-free for over a decade. I remember holding the notice in my hands before it was sent, the weight of it feeling heavier than any of the checks I'd written for the carriage house. It wasn't just paper, it was accountability. It was the first time in years that my father's assumed control over property, over us, had a visible counterforce. While the letters were being finalized, I shifted into preparation mode. I documented everything. Photos of the bruise on Noah's back, the one that lingered even after the initial swelling subsided, went into a file labeled December 25th. The pediatric exam report from her follow-up was scanned and stored. I logged every past comment, every exclusion, every subtle slight that had built up over years, creating a timeline that would withstand scrutiny. Screenshots from that evening's text messages were numbered, cataloged, and cross-referenced. The voice recording of my father declaring ownership, the bank confirmations for rent, the trust statements, everything went into a single, detailed dossier. Then came the final step for that week, reporting the incident to Child Protective Services. It was December 29th. 14 adults had watched a child get shoved across a hardwood floor and done nothing. I refused to let it slide. I called the caseworker, explained the incident, provided documentation, and submitted the report. I was calm, precise, unyielding, the same way I had learned to be in the ER when lives depended on a meticulous hand. The act of reporting felt monumental. I could still hear the echo of the hardwood impact in the dining room, feel Noah's small body trembling in my arms, and the way the room had gone silent, frozen, as if the air itself were complicit. Filing the report made that silence official. It wasn't just a family dispute anymore, it was institutional. The escalation had a formal backbone now. As I closed my laptop that evening, reviewing the photos and documents one last time, I felt the subtle shift that I had been sensing since Alina's confirmation. The tides were turning. Legal, financial, and protective mechanisms were aligning to defend Noah, and in doing so, to challenge the narrative my father had imposed for years. For the first time, the fight wasn't just in my head or in our small cottage. It was in systems bigger than any of us, and it had teeth. The escalation was real, official, and irreversible. Almost immediately after the certified letters went out and the trust was frozen, the backlash began. My father's calls came first, rapid, furious, a litany of accusations and threats. "You're turning your own grandmother against me," he yelled at one point, the veins in his neck straining, the tone somewhere between disbelief and entitlement. I stayed calm, letting the recording app run silently in the background, catching every word. There was something about hearing him rage unfiltered that made the quiet control I had maintained at Christmas feel like the calm before an inevitable storm. My mother, Elise, called separately, her voice trembling. She was crying, the kind of helpless, shaky sobs that made me want to reach through the phone and comfort her. But I couldn't. I had learned over years that sympathy didn't change behavior. She was caught in the momentum of my father's rage, and her tears were as performative as they were real. I listened, let her speak, and stayed unshaken. Then came my sister, Marin, via text. Accusations that I was stealing, that I was overreaching, that I had somehow hijacked the family property for personal gain. Every word stung differently because it carried the weight of perceived betrayal from someone I had once trusted. I could feel the emotional weight pressing in, but at the same time, there was clarity in knowing that the resistance was a predictable layer of escalation, a reaction to exposure. Shortly after, a group text began circulating among cousins and aunts, implying that my grandmother's mental state was declining, that perhaps she was not fully in control of her faculties. I recognized the tactic immediately, undermined the source of authority and truth to shift doubt. I paused, breathed, then forwarded my father's recorded tirade to my aunt. The audio was clear. His words, unedited, betrayed entitlement, rage, and a desperate claim of ownership. There was no questioning it. It stood in stark contrast to the narrative he tried to spread in texts. The effect was immediate. The tone in the group began to shift almost overnight. People who had whispered, speculated, and aligned with him now paused. The unvarnished recording countered years of subtle manipulation, making the power inversion visible. For the first time in years, my father did not control the narrative. He did not dominate the room. I remember sitting on the couch that night, phone in hand, listening to the replies trickle in. Some were defensive, some apologetic, but the balance of power had shifted. My actions, the legal documentation, the frozen trust, the recorded confrontation, had made the invisible visible. Family members could no longer act blindly, could no longer assume his word was law. I felt the tension relax in my shoulders, tempered with wariness. This was only the beginning of the reckoning, but it was a public, undeniable inversion of control. The meeting at my grandmother Aliner's assisted living facility felt tense from the moment we walked in. She sat at the head of the long table, her posture straight, her expression calm but unyielding. There was a presence about her that filled the room in a way my father could never command, decades of quiet authority and clarity distilled into a single figure. Around the table, my father and mother, Marin, and various relatives settled, some shifting uneasily, others feigning composure, all sensing the gravity of what was coming. Daniel Reyes opened with the land records. Each page was laid out, organized meticulously, showing deed transfers or rather the lack thereof. The carriage house and the main house remained legally Aliner's. My father leaned forward, bristling, eyes darting to my grandmother, searching for some crack, some sign he could exploit. There was none. Next came the trust withdrawals. Daniel went line by line, carefully explaining the $112,400 that had been removed over the years, nearly all allocated for my niece Sloane. Noah's name did not appear anywhere. The numbers, stark and undeniable, revealed years of exclusion in cold print. Marin shifted uncomfortably, murmuring excuses, but no argument could counter the clarity of the ledger. Then my grandmother reached for the audio recording. She pressed play. My father's voice, raw and unfiltered, filled the quiet room. "It's my property. I've owned it for years." The weight of his entitlement, his anger, and his insistence echoed, unchallenged, in a way that no prior family confrontation had ever allowed. I saw color drain from his face as the words sank in, and I could hear the subtle reactions around the table: gasps, stifled murmurs, a few hands covering mouths. Finally, the CPS voicemail confirming the open investigation into the Christmas incident was played. My father's eyes widened, the tense red of anger giving way to a rare, visible panic. He leaned back, hands trembling slightly, the facade of control slipping. My mother wept quietly beside him, and Marin's lips pressed into a thin line. The family that had previously acted as a wall of complicity now confronted the evidence of their inaction and my father's entitlement. For the first time in years, he had no control over the room. Every assertion, every claim, every whispered attempt at manipulation fell flat against the documentation, recordings, and legal authority marshaled at that table. The power had shifted completely, and the room held it like a tangible presence. It wasn't just about property anymore, it was about exposure, about finally showing the family the full scope of what had been done, and the repercussions were immediate, undeniable. I remained quiet through it, seated beside Noah, watching her small hand curl around mine. I didn't need to speak. The truth was loud enough. My father's visible unraveling, Aliner's unwavering composure, and Daniel's calm authority completed the public exposure. The reckoning was not a rumor, a threat, or a hypothetical. It was here, tangible, and irreversible. By February, The repercussions of the assisted living meeting began to crystallize into formal consequences, ones that finally separated the abusive dynamics from my daughter and me. CPS required my father to enroll in a court-approved anger management program. I remember receiving the official notice and feeling a strange mix of relief and vindication, relief that the system was now engaged, and vindication that his pattern of aggression was being acknowledged outside the confines of our family drama. It wasn't a fix, not entirely, but it was the first structured action against the chaos he'd caused. Simultaneously, Daniel worked to recover what had been taken financially. Within 6 weeks, he secured repayment of $16,800, the most recent year of rent I'd paid to a property my father didn't legally own. I watched as that sum, which represented months of my labor and sacrifice, was returned to me. It was symbolic as much as practical, a tangible acknowledgement that I had been wronged repeatedly. Around the same time, after weeks of resistance, my sister, Marin, reluctantly agreed to repay $58,000 into Noah's amended education trust. The agreement spanned 2 years, but already by spring, the trust balance had climbed above $54,600, with structured monthly deposits continuing. Watching that balance rise, knowing it was being built in Noah's name, gave me a quiet, simmering satisfaction. It wasn't wealth I sought, but acknowledgement and security for my child. By March, I had formally requested no direct contact with both my father and Noah. Filing for this protection felt like the final, immovable boundary, a brick wall separating us from years of manipulation, entitlement, and abuse. Soon after, I received a handwritten letter from my father. The paper was neat, the ink deliberate, but the words themselves accused me of destroying the family. I held it in my hands for a long while, feeling the weight of his denial and projection. I didn't respond, I didn't have to, he'd already exposed himself. Not long after, a birthday card arrived from my mother addressed to Noah. It was written with her familiar cursive, signed, "Love, Mom," but it contained no acknowledgement of what had happened, no apology, no recognition of the Christmas incident. I set it aside. Accountability, I realized, didn't come in pastel envelopes or polite phrasing. I kept it, though, tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of both what was given and what was withheld. The structural separation was now real and permanent. Noah and I had our boundaries codified through the law and through deliberate action. My father had imposed anger management, my sister's payments were scheduled, the trust was secured in Noah's name, and I had established a no-contact line that could not be crossed without consequences. For the first time, the protective structures around my child were formalized and undeniable, and the family as I had known it could no longer operate in the shadows of entitlement, abuse, or denial. The first session with Dr. Priya Mehta felt like stepping into a quiet room after years of storm. I remember the way she arranged her chair across from mine, the soft tilt of her head as she listened without judgment. Noah sat beside me, small fingers curled around mine, and for the first time, she said aloud what I had been aching to hear. "Mom, I feel like I really belong here." Her words sank into my chest, and I could feel the tension I had carried for months slowly loosen, though not completely. Later that night, after tucking her in and hearing her soft, even breaths, I allowed myself to cry quietly in the kitchen. No one could see, no one would interrupt, and it wasn't sadness as much as a release, a reckoning that the worst had passed, and yet the weight of what had been endured still lingered. Sundays became sacred. Elinor, my grandmother, arrived without ceremony, bringing simple treats and gentle conversation, staying long enough to reassure Noah that she was seen and supported, then leaving before the day could feel crowded or intrusive. The house settled into a rhythm I hadn't known it could have. Quiet, but honest. Walls that had once echoed with accusation and humiliation now held laughter, careful planning, and soft arguments over homework or dinner. I noticed the subtle shifts, Noah asking questions with curiosity instead of fear, her gaze lingering on me with trust instead of caution. I began reframing what family meant, not as a set of obligations or inherited titles, but as a structure built on respect, safety, and choice. Even when the phone rang with old numbers or the mailbox delivered letters in familiar handwriting, the old panic no longer gripped me. I kept copies of all legal documents, all proof of boundaries, but I carried them lightly, like tools on a belt rather than shields over my heart. Noah's laughter as she chased the cat through the living room reminded me that reclaiming joy was possible, that it could coexist with memory without erasing it. I would sit in the living room at night, listening to Noah's soft humming from her bedroom, and sometimes catch Alina's quiet footsteps as she left for the day. I felt a kind of permanence settle in, not because the past had disappeared, but because the power had shifted irreversibly. This was our home, our life, and the boundaries I had fought for were no longer negotiable. The echo of past abuses still lingered, but now it carried the weight of triumph instead of fear. Thank you for watching. If it resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more real-life experiences like this one. There's another story waiting for you in the description that explores the complexities of family, boundaries, and reclaiming your own voice.